Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we'll be looking at First Chronicles chapters 11 through 29 in our continuing study of the historical books. We've already seen chapters 1 through 10, where we had the genealogies of Israel and then the death of King Saul, and we started into just the first couple of verses of the reign of King David. That's going to take us through the rest of First Chronicles. We won't really get to Solomon. He'll be introduced here. He'll actually become king here, but we won't really see that much of him until we get to Second Chronicles. So this is going to be the histories of Israel's first two kings, that is, right at the end of Saul and now David, but Solomon's going to be introduced. Verse 4, then David and all Israel went to Jerusalem, that is Jebus. Notice how Jerusalem and Jebus and Salem, it has a number of different names, all related. And the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, were there. The inhabitants of Jebus said to David, you shall not enter here. Nevertheless, David captured the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. Notice how Zion is just another name for the city of David, and Jebus and Jerusalem. You say, I thought the city of David was Bethlehem. Well, Bethlehem is the city in which he was born, but Jerusalem is now going to be his city as he captures it. And sure enough, it's captured. Verse 6, now David had said, whoever strikes down a Jebusite first shall be chief and commander. Well, who did that? It was Joab. Joab, the son of Zeruiah, went up first, so he became chief. And we're going to see Joab as the military commander under King David, as David now becomes king. Notice the chart. We read in First Samuel how he he goes up the water tunnel. There's a spring at the bottom of the Kidron Valley, and we've actually found the tunnel there, where you could go up underneath the city walls. Now, that wasn't supposed to be open to the public, but it was there, and apparently he found the opening and used that to enter the city and to capture the city. So verse 7, then David dwelt in the stronghold, therefore it was called the city of David. He built the city all around from the Milo. The Milo seems to have been a rise, um, hump or hill would be an okay translation, even to the surrounding area. And Joab repaired the rest of the city. There's probably some destruction involved in capturing it, but now that's repaired. Verse 9, David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. So Jerusalem, which had been a neutral Canaanite city, not neutral to the Israelites, but neutral in the sense that it didn't belong to Judah, it didn't belong to Benjamin, it didn't belong to any one tribe, in the same way that Washington, D.C. in the United States doesn't belong to any one state. It's in the District of Columbia. It's in a non-state area, and Jerusalem was like that. Here's a map. Now, this is compliments of the Rose Publication Society, showing both David's city of Jerusalem was really fairly small, built on a high ridge. And if you followed that ridge to the north, you would eventually come to Mount Moriah, where eventually we're going to see the temple built, but not yet. That's not until Second Chronicles. And so the Mount Moriah was up there, but that's just somebody's threshing floor. And notice the valleys around it. You've got the Kidron Valley on the east side, separating the city from the Mount of Olives even further to the east. And then the Kidron and the Hinnom Valley connect. And the Hinnom just goes around not just Jerusalem, but around that next mountain, that next rise, the western mountain to the west, and sort of cuts off that entire section, which is Jerusalem's eventually going to grow out to that area by the time we get to the New Testament, and even before we get to the New Testament period. Even under kings like Hezekiah, we'll see it growing out in that direction. Likewise, the Temple Mount will eventually have walls around it as well. So Jerusalem is a Canaanite city. Ebla tablets. Ebla is a city that we found in the entire library way up in northern Syria, and they make references to Jerusalem as early as 2400 BC. It's considered a neutral city by the Israelites, and it has historic connections to Abraham via Genesis chapter 14. Remember the story where Abraham goes to rescue Lot, and he comes back, and he is met By the king of Jerusalem, a unusual person by the name of Melchizedek, who is a priest of the Most High God. Instead of being a priest of pagan gods, he actually was a priest of the right God, the Most High God. And he meets Abraham, and there are blessings, and there's a meal, and it's just a delightful, although very, very sketchily described, a delightful encounter that made it into the scriptures. Now, this is also the city from which Jesus is going to provide redemption. So, in a sense, it's a city that's important not just to the Jews, not just to Israel, but to the entire world, because this is the city where it all took place. Verse 10, now these are the heads of the mighty men whom David had, who gave him strong support in his kingdom. We already started with Joab, the first one to strike down somebody from the city of Jebus, together with all Israel to make him king, according to the word of the Lord concerning Israel. And so we're going to look now at the mighty men, the Roshi HaGiborim. Roshi is just like the heads, and Giborim, just the mighty ones, and it's masculine, so it's the mighty men. David was then in the stronghold, while the garrison of the Philistines was then in Bethlehem. Now, he's telling us one of the stories of the mighty men. I've wondered when I looked at this reference to the stronghold, because the term there, the stronghold, the way you say that in Hebrew is Bet Matsuda. It sounds a little bit like Masada. Why does it sound like that? Because it's the same word. Now, I'm not saying that David was in the fortification we know as Masada today, but the way you say stronghold or fortification, the Hebrew word for that is Masada. And if you go to Bethlehem, there is a nearby Masada there. Doesn't go by that name. It actually goes by the name Herodium, a fortress that Herod the Great eventually built there. And makes me wonder, was there something there that was big enough to serve as a fortification in David's day? I'm not sure that there was. So I don't know if that's where he was or some other place that was near Bethlehem. But while they are there, David had a craving and said, "Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate." David had grown up in Bethlehem. That was the city of his birth, and they are there surrounding Bethlehem with the Philistines who've captured the town. And David saying, "Man, it's dry and it's hot, and boy, we had great water in there." Hearing that, so notice the three mighty men that we're speaking of broke through the camp of the Philistines and drew water from the well of Bethlehem, which was by the gate, and took it and brought it to David. Like they're going to risk their lives just to bring him a drink of water. Nevertheless, David would not drink it, but poured it out to the Lord. Why wouldn't he drink it? Because he looked at the value of the lives of his men much greater than that drink of water that he wanted. So, there was no way to compare the two. But notice he just doesn't pour it out. I mean, he does, but he pours it out as an offering to the Lord, as if to say, I'm not worthy of them risking their lives, but God is worthy. But God is worthy. We continue, and he said, far be it from me before my God that I should do this. Shall I drink the blood of these men who went at the risk of their lives? For at the risk of their lives they brought it. Therefore he would not drink it. And these things the three mighty men did. So just some stories about his mighty men. It reminds us of Jesus, where we have David born in Bethlehem, Jesus also born in Bethlehem. In the David story, his mighty men put themselves at risk on behalf of David. In the Jesus story, he is the mighty man who gave of himself for us, for others. In the David story, he poured out the water that they brought because of their sacrifice, and he said, I'm not worthy of that. In the case of Jesus, he poured out his own blood for us. Not that we were worthy, he is the worthy one, but he did it out of his grace and mercy as the ultimate sacrifice on our behalf. And so we have looked at his mighty men. Now, we are going to continue. We'll see the Ark of the Covenant and worship with regard to the Ark. We will see covenant promises. We'll see the temple site, and these are all coming up. And of course, we described this as the histories of Israel's first two kings. But I want to look again at chapter, not just 11, but also chapter 12, chapter 11, we saw David's mighty men in action, at least a little bit of that. In chapter 12, we're going to see that David is recognized by other mighty men. So, chapter 12, verse 1. Now, these are the ones who came to David at Ziklag. Remember, Ziklag was when he'd been on the run from Saul, and he goes down to the Philistines, and the Philistines say, why don't you take one of our cities? You're going to be on our side now. You're going to be a good Philistine. And you take the city of Ziklag. And notice, while he was still restricted because of Saul, the son of Kish, that period when he'd been separated, and they were among the mighty men who helped him in war, these ones that came to him there. And they were equipped with bows, using both the right hand and the left to sling stones and to shoot arrows from the bow. They were Saul's kinsmen from Benjamin. Notice we didn't see this in First and Second Kings. We didn't see this in First and Second Samuel, that there were those who had come to follow David back when he was still on the outs with Saul, when Saul was still seeking him and trying to kill him. Even some from Benjamin had aligned themselves to David, the tribe from which Saul came. And notice how they describe it. They could use both the right hand and the left to throw stones, to throw arrows. Not everyone can do that. Not everyone is what we call ambidextrous, able to equally use the right and or the left hand, but these could. And so this is while David was at Ziklag, and yet while he was there, Saul's kinsmen came to recognize his king, not Saul's kingship, David's kingship. And so we have chapter 12, verses 1 through 7, where you've got the men who came from Saul's relatives from Benjamin. They were trained in the bow and the sling, in the right hand and the left hand. In verses 8 through 15, we see men who came from Gad. Gad was one of those tribes on the east side of the Jordan River. Remember, there was Reuben, Gad, and half a tribe of Manasseh. And these men also came. They were trained in the spear and the shield, and they came to align themselves at that very early date with David. And then finally, we have a mixed group from both Benjamin and Judah, again, in those early days, in verses 16 through 18. And in their case, their loyalty was questioned. Not everyone from Benjamin was questioned, but these folks were. Like, are they really legit, or did Saul send them merely to be a trap and maybe to give a report, or maybe to assassinate David? And there was a little bit of a question mark at first, but that was eventually resolved. And so verse 16, then some of the sons of Benjamin and Judah came to the stronghold of David. Here's that story. David went out to meet them and said to them, if you come peacefully to me to help me, my heart shall be united with you. But if to betray me to my adversaries, in particular Saul, since there is no wrong in my hands, may the God of our fathers look on it and decide. Let God be the one who decides. And so notice, if you come peacefully, or if you come to betray me. And he wasn't entirely sure what's that going to be. And so verse 18, then the Spirit came upon Amasai, who was the chief of the 30, and he said, and notice the Spirit comes upon him. I think that's pretty neat, that God is working in them and through them. Literally, the Spirit clothed Amasai. I just think that's a neat picture there. That same phraseology is used of Gideon in Judges chapter 6, verse 34. It's used of Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, in 2 Chronicles chapter 24, at the end of that book. So the Spirit came upon Amasai, who was the chief of the 30, and he said, here it is, we are yours, O David, and with you, O son of Jesse, peace to you, and peace to him who helps you. Indeed, your God helps you. And so it's almost like, now he doesn't take an oath in the sense of putting a curse on himself, but he's calling for peace, and he's invoking even the name of the Lord. And so David received them and made them captains of the band, and they become part of David's company, and the suspicion is put aside. So you have giftedness, but you also have faithfulness. And in David's mighty men, you had the marriage of both. They were gifted, but they were also faithful to him. Now that's verse 16 through 18. Next, we have men of Manasseh. Remember Manasseh? Manasseh was a tribe that had territory on both sides of the Jordan. So half tribe of Manasseh was on the east side of the Jordan. The other half of Manasseh was on the west side of the Jordan. And they fought the raiders of Ziklag. Remember Ziklag, that it was captured while David was away? These showed up to actually help take it back. And so verse 22, for day by day men came to David to help him until there was a great army like the army of God. You can almost say a God-sized army that showed up. And this is all when David was on the run from Saul. So David, who had been rejected, can I call him the rejected anointed one? Because David had been anointed. And when I say that, the way I say that in Hebrew is David, the rejected Messiah, is gradually being recognized by a growing army from those places that were supposed to have rejected him. But that's just a picture of Jesus, who is our rejected Messiah, hopefully not rejected by us, who is gradually being recognized by a growing church. And I'm hoping that you, as the listener, are part of that growing church, part of that growing people that are recognizing Jesus as the Messiah. So we continue. We've got the mighty men, and now we have the story of the ark and the worship involved with it. Look at that. We've got in chapter 13 the Ark of the Covenant, and we begin with a relocation where it is brought into the area of Jerusalem. The Philistines attacked David at Jerusalem in chapter 14, and now the Ark of the Covenant is specifically brought into a tent. Now that tent is still in Jerusalem. You say, well, what happened to the tabernacle? The tabernacle was in another place. It's going to get relocated too, but it's not going to be there with the Ark of the Covenant. So the two are separated. And in chapter 16, we have a song of praise, which largely is taken from two Psalms in the book of Psalms. So half of that is taken from Psalm 105, verses 1 through 15. And then the other half is Psalm 96, verses 1 through 13. And so you see them here, and then you see those same Psalms in the book of Psalms. Chapter 16, verse 7, then on that day, David first assigned Asaph. Now, speaking of the Psalms, remember there's a whole what we call book 3 that are described as Psalms of Asaph, Psalms that involve worship and things like that. On that day, David first assigned Asaph and his relatives to give thanks to the Lord. And so their purpose was that of thanksgiving, leading in worship and thanksgiving. First Chronicles chapter 16, verses 8 through 22 are going to be echoed in Psalm 105, verses 1 through 15. So we're gonna sort of link the Psalms to different songs that are given here, different Thanksgiving Psalms. We go down to verses 23 through 33, and that's echoed in Psalm 96, verses 1 through 13. We look at verses 34 through 36 is echoed in Psalm 106, starting with verse 1, but then skipping down to verses 47 and 48. It's an exact match that takes place. And so verse 37, so he left Asaph and his relatives there before the ark of the covenant of the Lord to minister before the ark continually. That was their job, as every day's work required. And Obed-Edom with his 68 relatives, Obed-Edom also the son of Jeduthun, and Hosha the gatekeepers. And so you've got Asaph watching over the Ark of the Covenant. But then he left Zadok the priest. That's a different family. There's still a family of priests, still descendants of Aaron, but a different family of priests. He left Zadok the priest and his relatives, the priests, before the tabernacle of the Lord in the high place, which was at Gibeon. Now, we had read way in the past where the tabernacle had been down at Shiloh, near to where Jericho was, down in the Arabah, in the Jordan River Valley. But since that time, and for quite some time, it has been moved now to Gibeon. Remember, Gibeon was a city that was a Canaanite city that had lied about how far they were, and they had made a treaty with Joshua and the Israelites, and they had entered into a treaty, not realizing that Gibeon was just over the hill. It was fairly close. But that's now become a sanctified place, a place loyal to the Lord. They're not worshiping pagan gods. In fact, they're going to be home to the tabernacle. Verse 40, to offer burnt offerings to the Lord on the altar of burnt offering continually, morning and evening. So this is where the worship takes place. There's an altar here where every morning and every evening, they will do a sacrifice and prayers and remembering the Lord continually, even according to all that is written in the law of the Lord, which he commanded Israel. By the way, notice in the picture, the tabernacle looks a little bit permanent. It was supposed to be a tent, but you know what happens to a tent when it's in the same place year after year and century after century? It's a little bit like what we call a mobile home park, where the homes aren't mobile anymore. They were originally designed that way, perhaps, but they don't move around anymore. And the tabernacle is like that. It's not going to be doing much moving anymore. And so here they are at Gibeon. By way of review, then, we saw David becoming king when he captured Jerusalem, Joab taking the city. Next, we saw David's military exploits and the exploits of his mighty men. We see David's plan to bring the ark to Jerusalem. It had initially been prevented, where you have that incident where Uzzah had tried to. They were moving the ark on a cart, and it was bouncing along. It looked like it was going to fall over, and Uzzah lifted up his hands and touched the ark with his hands. He wasn't supposed to do that, and he died. And so that was prevented for a time. And David begins to build his house and establish his rule. But then we finally come to chapters 15 and 16, where the ark actually does come to Jerusalem, and that becomes the focus of all the prayers of praise, the psalms of praise that we've been looking at, and the priests being assigned their duty. So that's the pivotal point in this entire section from chapters 11 all the way to chapter 21. But we're not quite done yet. After the pivotal point, now we find out that David is planning to build the Lord's house. And again, he's prevented. Not that nobody dies over it this time. There's nothing bad here, but God shows up and says, "No, you're not going to build my house. The ark is under curtains, and that's fine, and you're not going to change that. A house will be built, but you're not going to do that, David. Instead, the Lord's going to build David an eternal house. In other words, a whole dynasty. There's going, and not just a temporary dynasty. We'll see in the northern kingdom of Israel where there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, depending on how you count them, 5 different dynasties ruling at different times over Israel. In David's case, in the southern kingdom's case, even though the kingdom will be split, that's not going to happen. It will be David and his family all the way to eternity. You say, how does that work? Well, because the last one is Jesus, who is the ultimate son of David, is related to David. In fact, I would suggest, judging from the genealogies of both Matthew chapter 1 and Luke as well, gives a genealogy. I think that Matthew is giving us the genealogy of Jesus through Joseph, the adopted father of Jesus. And then I'm going to suggest, I think, that Luke is giving us the genealogy through Mary, because Luke tells us Mary's story, Mary's visions, Mary's encounters with angels and things like that. So I think what you have there are really both sides of the family, both the adopted side and the physical side, because Jesus was a physical son of Mary. And in both cases, they are going to be connected to that house of David, and so that he will be that final eternal house. And David's making the plans, but he's prevented. Now he can continue making the plans, but he's not going to carry it out. That will be left to his son Solomon. Next, we're going to see another story, actually 3 chapters of David's military exploits. And then finally, we will see David purchasing the Temple Mount. Now, that's in the midst of sort of a bad story where Joab carries out a census at David's command, and that was not the right thing to do. They were supposed to keep in mind that Israel's going to be like the sands of the sea that cannot be counted, but David wanted to count them anyway. And so there's a punishment involved in that. But David comes through after having stood in the way of death, the punishment of death, and said, "Take me instead." And God doesn't take him, but God does stop the punishment. He's, again, a beautiful picture of the greater David who would go to the cross saying, "Take me instead," and would offer his life as a sacrifice for our sins. Now, chapters 22 through 29, which are going to bring us to the end of First Chronicles, you have David calling Solomon, his son, and giving instructions about the temple. And that's going to be in chapter 22. And there'll be instructions about gathering materials, where to get them, instructions given to the people. You be sure to support Solomon as he becomes king. Remember chapter 22, verse 5, he's young and inexperienced. Don't take advantage of that, because the Lord has called for Solomon to build the temple instead of David. And so he's going to be doing that in the next book, but he's not going to start here in First Chronicles. He won't start it until we get to Second Chronicles. Next, we see David appointing Solomon as king, chapter 23 and verse 1. Remember that because we're going to see him appointed again in a while as king. But here he had already been appointed. David is still alive, but Solomon is co-ruling and wearing the crown and taking leadership. Next, we have the Levites and their duties in assisting the priests. We have the priests and their duties um, in chapter 24. And what we find out, there are officers of the sanctuary, there's officers of the Lord to represent him, and the entire priesthood is organized into 24 courses, where each course will take its turn twice a year serving. That way, a priest doesn't have to be in the temple like 24/7, 12 days a month, 12 months a year. They can do their duties, and then they can go back home and take care of business and do any farming and anything that needs to be taken care of. So twice a year, plus the times of the special sacrifices. There's 52 weeks in a year, so if you've got 24 courses doing 1 or 2 weeks each, that's only 48 weeks. What about the other weeks? Well, there's special times. There's Passover, and there's Pentecost, and there's Yom Kippur, and there is the Feast of Sukkot, what we call the Feast of Tabernacles, which is an entire week. And at those times, all the priests will be present. But they are organized into 24 courses. Now, remember, in Revelation chapter 4, where John is carried up in the spirit into heaven, and he sees before the throne of God, and he sees these 4 living creatures, and he sees 24 elders. And you're supposed to say, 24, I know that number. That reminds me of the 24 courses of priests that were there at the temple. It's temple imagery. I get that. You're supposed to understand that. Next, we have the Levites again, this time their duties as musicians and gatekeepers. That's chapters 25 and 26. And then David appoints commanders and government officials to assist Solomon. And then finally, we come to the end, chapters 28 and 29, where he assembles the people. David assembles the people and gives a speech about the temple, about how the Lord has called for Solomon to build the temple instead of David, about how there are plans and materials that have been gathered and are going to continue to be gathered for the work. And again, there's this reference to Solomon being young and inexperienced, so don't take advantage of him. Help him instead. Now, chapter 29, verse 21, on the next day, they made sacrifices to the Lord and offered burnt offerings to the Lord, 1,000 bulls, 1,000 rams, 1,000 lambs with their drink offerings and sacrifices in abundance for all Israel. That is a lot of animals being put to death. And of course, when they're put to death, that's both for sacrifice, but then you take the parts that didn't get burned up, and you have a big feast. You celebrate the sacrifice. You celebrate what God has accomplished. And there's a lot of food at this feast. And so they ate and drank that day before the Lord with great gladness. That was a good thing. And they made Solomon, the son of David, king a second time. Now, we already saw First Chronicles chapter 23, verse 1. He had been made king, and now they're doing it again. And they appointed him as ruler for the Lord, and Zadok as priest. And it reminds us that the greater David, the one who is greater than Solomon, not only came a first time, but he is going to come a second time. And in a sense, the first time he was recognized as king. There were people that were saying, hail is the one, praise the one who's coming in the son of David. But when he comes again, it will, can I say, I'm not going to just say it will be as king, it will also be as king. He will again be high and lifted up, not on a cross this time, like he was the first time, but in a more powerful, I'm not sure if I should say it that way, because let me just say the cross was pretty powerful, but in a more visibly powerful way. Can I say it that way? I think that works. And it reminds us of what Hebrews says, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27, and inasmuch as it is appointed for men to die once, and after this comes judgment, so Christ also, so the anointed one also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation, without reference to sin, to those who eagerly await him. Are you eagerly awaiting him? If you're trusting in him as your Lord and Savior, then you are.